Hello, this is SK Williams, and this video is one I wasn't intending on making. And I have no script, but the news is very breaking. I intended on doing a replacement for another video I made some months ago about Meta's attacks on Chris Avail, and how he's actually pretty much a bad person for those. And to correct, I took the original down because I made a mistake in it. Not that it matters. Being a Christian means my mistakes count against me for the rest of my life. Meanwhile, Meta can lie and get away with it constantly. The same person who said I can't be trusted ever again will trust Meta, even though everything he said was false. Not that it matters. I also intended on doing an update video. But right now, something happened that's rather pressing, and it got me thinking about dispensational theology. And for those who don't know what dispensational theology is, dispensationalism is the same theology that was used as inspiration for the Left Behind novel series and the movies based on them. It is about the rapture of the church, and it's one of those that the media doesn't really understand and quite often presents as evidence that fundamentalist Christians are dangerous because the fundamentalists think if they can get the Jews back to Israel, then it will make Jesus come again. And some even use it as proof that they are anti-Semitic. Because when Jesus comes back, we're told that these Christian fundamentalists believe that Jesus will kill all Jews and send them to hell. And it's all just proof that they're anti-Semitic, and that even though they say they support Israel, it's really the highest form of anti-Semitism. And in reality, that's not what they believe, and their beliefs are far more nuanced. However, this video is not about dispensational theology proper. It is not about actually going through the details of it. Although I will have to say that it's not really fundamentalist Christians, but it's more evangelical and Pentecostal Christians. The word fundamentalism doesn't really mean anything anymore. It's generally used as a slur to make people afraid. But it does have a proper meaning, and I've discussed that before too, but I shan't here to stay on some focus. But I will say this. The evangelicals who believe in dispensational theology, and the Pentecostals who largely get this from them, from the evangelicals, don't really think they can make Jesus come faster. They are not supporting Israel because they think that they can get Jesus to return, that if they do certain things, Jesus will come back. Rather, they think of these as prophetic road signs, that certain events will happen, that God has ordained them to happen, God has foreseen them happening, they will happen, they're part of God's plan. It isn't so much that it's not so much that God told them, Jesus will return if you do these things, and they are trying to do those things to bring Jesus back. It is rather that they believe that Jesus will return after certain signs are shown. Now, this video is actually, however, not about dispensational theology at all. I'm rather simply thinking about dispensational theology and using it as an allegory. Although I am quite certain there are Christians who believe in dispensational theology who are rather watching with interest the war happening in Israel between Israel and Hamas. And no doubt, it very much looks like this could very well be the build-up to the end times and the return of Christ, because this war seems to be checking those boxes, which is exactly why it came to my mind. It does seem to tick those boxes. This could, of course, be dismissed as coincidence. But, be it coincidence, be they right in their theology, or be they somewhere in the middle where they're partially right in their theology and this is somehow prophetic, but they're not right about everything, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that I think that the dispensational model, assuming it's not literally true in terms of the theological aspects, could still nevertheless help us understand what is happening now and what could happen in the future. Since this just happened today, I intend on doing another video on this, but I am notoriously bad about following up since my life sometimes gets busy and I don't get to. Nevertheless, I will endeavor to do another video on this where I elaborate. But for this video, I'm first going to give a very, very superficial view of dispensational theology. This will be necessary so you can understand what I'm talking about. However, I'm only going to go into detail later in the video, and even then, I'm not going to go into detail about large sections of it, because those sections aren't the part that's necessary for the point that I'm making. And I often like using literature, or fiction, or philosophy, or history, to help us understand different concepts or aspects of something, because it quite often helps. And that, I think, is what we need to look at here. Because as I speak now, Norway, Spain, and Ireland have all agreed to recognize Palestine as a state and to back the Arab Peace Initiative from several years ago, an initiative which, quite frankly, cannot be accepted. To be fair, when it was first proposed, it was not actually intended to be a treaty that was signed, but rather an opening of a negotiation. So it makes sense that they would give these extraordinarily high and broad terms, knowing that they're not going to get them all. However, the Arab Peace Initiative was superseded by the Abraham Accords and are now resurfacing, not simply as a means or tool of negotiation with Israel, but rather as an actual peace plan. And to understand why that is ridiculous, if you read the initiative, you will soon know that it calls for Israel to withdraw from all territory that it won in the 1967 war, territory that it has now had for several decades, and which have now been largely built up by Israelis. It also calls for Israel to take in large number of Palestinian refugees. And it calls for East Jerusalem to be ceded to the Palestinian state and used as its capital. These demands, while okay if you're simply bringing them as the opening of a negotiation since you know you're going to be whittled down, meeting somewhere in the middle, are ludicrous on their face and obviously cannot be agreed to by Israel. Israel simply cannot accept the Palestinian refugees, because Palestinians can either be radicalized later, or already are radicalized, or are perhaps even members of Hamas that are unknown to the Israeli Defense Forces. And if you allow them in as refugees, they could easily disseminate themselves throughout all of Israel, bide their time to the right moment, and then wreak havoc through the nation in another war where they are not simply fighting enemies that are over a wall, but are also in the gates already. Asking them to take in refugees, even though not all of the refugees would be militant or would turn on them, is asking them to accept the very real possibility that there will be large numbers who are, and who can wreak a lot of devastation, meaning that they would have to not only fight enemies outside their walls, but enemies inside the walls as well. That would be a nonsensical proposition for any nation under any sort of similar situation to agree to. And yet this is exactly what Norway, Spain, and Ireland are saying Israel should agree to. Likewise, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Granted, most of the world would say Tel Aviv is the capital of Israel, but Israel thinks of Jerusalem as its capital. And do you really want your capital city to be torn in half, with half of it going to a hostile nation, and that hostile nation using that as its capital? Even from a purely practical consideration, your enemy is now directly on the border of your capital. And even if a peace accord is met, they could easily begin hostilities again. It would be a nonsensical situation to expect Israel to acquiesce to that demand. It makes absolutely no sense. Unless, of course, you insist that Tel Aviv is the capital, but doing so is unrealistic because no matter what European powers would say, or any other country, Jerusalem runs its national affairs through Jerusalem. So even though officially, in all countries around the world, or at the very least within Europe and the Americas and the Western world, think Tel Aviv is the real capital of Jerusalem is the one that Israel has declared, because Israel is the one that actually runs its government from that city, and they don't run it from Tel Aviv, they run it from Jerusalem. That is a simple reality. And they simply won't extricate themselves from Jerusalem to go back to Tel Aviv, which, by the way, was the capital prior to the 1967 war. It is unrealistic to expect that to be done. And ultimately, do you really want one city to be shared by two countries? I know some people would counter that that would actually not be the case. Rather, Jerusalem would now be Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, two different cities. But realistically it won't be, because everyone in the region thinks of Jerusalem as a single city for religious, cultural, and historical purposes. So even if you officially declare that this is now two cities, even if they formally secede East Jerusalem and declare it the city of East Jerusalem, people will think of it as simply part of Jerusalem. And ultimately, considering how Palestine is antagonistic toward Israel, from the Israeli point of view, not only is your capital Jerusalem, and you would have a hostile nation directly on your border, with its capital directly on your border, but you really won't have any way of keeping them out of your capital, even over that dividing line. The simple reality is, Israel cannot agree to these accords. They can perhaps come up with some other solution. They could even perhaps come up with some other two-state solution. Obviously, they're not going to agree with the "from the river to the sea" slogan. But they could perhaps be talked into a different one. But the current talk of a two-state solution going by the Arab Peace Initiative is simply insane. Which is where we get our evangelical friends to come into the picture. At least those who believe in dispensational theology. And not all evangelicals or Pentecostals necessarily do, but those who do are perhaps thinking of this as a prophetic road sign of the end times. That, and Doctor Who wearing a skirt, being pro-abortion, being gay, and now ridiculing Christians. But I digress. The problem I have with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in terms of how we discuss it, is that it is a complex affair, which even in this video I shan't be going into detail on. I do intend on doing another one, but I may not be able to. But we can look at it this way. For the first time that I can remember, those who believe in dispensational theology have a valid point, and it looks legitimate. A lot of times, a lot of their things were stretching it, like people who thought Ronald Reagan or Barack Obama were the Antichrist because of the number of letters in their names or what have you. But this is exactly what they've been saying would happen for years, and even if you write it off as coincidence, it is still nevertheless interesting. And let's face reality, it's not pure coincidence. Certain things are, shall we say, easy to construct a mental picture of in your mind, even if no real divine origin exists for any sort of prophecy you're having. And in this case, the dispensational model says all the nations of the world will rise up against Israel, who will then be saved by a miracle from God. And as we sit here now, it looks like all the countries of the world are rising up against Israel. Israel is very tenacious, though, and it is quite possible that even in spite of their disadvantage and their size, that they will nevertheless pull through and win out. At the very least, they may not be destroyed. Still, with the European powers largely favouring the Palestinians, and with numerous protesters, especially university students, in Europe and in America and in Canada, all supporting the Palestinians, albeit without actually understanding the conflict and being financed by wealthy people who have their own political agenda and who are largely socialist or outright Marxist, and who are using the protests to push for a communist or socialist revolution in their respective countries. You still, nevertheless, have a situation where supporting Palestine is incredibly popular, not with everyone, but it is popular. And supporting Palestine means supporting Hamas in this situation, because Western powers are very lazy thinkers these days. So I could actually see the world rising up against Israel. I could see them attacking Israel, be it with some form of military force, be it direct military force, sending their own militaries down there, or indirect by aiding other powers in the local region to do so. But I could also see it as a political attack more than a military one, like putting sanctions on them, freezing assets, cutting them off from various diplomatic relations, things like that. It could very easily be that all the nations of the world will indeed attack Israel in some way, just as the prophecy says. And while the prophecy is mostly about Christians, because it is a Christian prophecy, they are largely irrelevant to my use of it as an allegory here. It may very well be that Israel is attacked by all the nations of the world, but miraculously saved, be it a literal miracle from God or simply an unexpected turn of events that's very impressive. But after that, after there is a strike on Israel that is foiled, we are supposed to see the rise of the man of sin, the Antichrist, the false prophet, those people. And it may very well be that there will be a charismatic leader, or perhaps a charismatic spokesman and a charismatic leader, or the like, who do rise up in this situation and capture the imagination of the world. Or it could be a group or a committee that do this, because again, I'm using it allegorically. It could very well be just one person, though, or it could be a group, or it could be a group represented by one charismatic man. But I could honestly see that man of sin, the Antichrist, and his false prophet rising in this situation, declaring peace and creating the proverbial, if not literal, 7-year peace plan, where everyone agrees to peace for a certain amount of time that is set to expire. In dispensationalism, they signed a 7-year peace treaty, not a perpetual one. And this, I suppose, could be explained in our world if they come up with a peace plan in order to gain a ceasefire so they can bring the Palestinians and Israelis to the same negotiating table with the rest of Europe and America. And should this happen, our false prophet and our Antichrist may get involved in these affairs, but with an ulterior motive, not to save Israel, not to save the Palestinians, not to save both of them, but to implement his own policies, and to use this situation to cement his power. It could very well be that organizations like the World Economic Forum or the World Bank or other groups that have shown interest in manipulating governments themselves send some sort of representative or delegation to Israel to negotiate a peace, which will lead to cries for restructuring international relations on a general scale. After all, Israel is not the only problem. We also have a war in Ukraine with Russia that still hasn't resolved. We have potential wars as China is threatening to invade Taiwan. We have issues in Africa that are going on right now as well. And in Europe and in America, we have plenty of protesters, or even in Canada, plenty of protesters fomenting violent revolution. In a world where all of our systems appear to be broken and declining, it could very easily be that the false prophet and the Antichrist step in to fill this void by promising peace, but to do so we must implement these particular policies, many of which may have nothing to do with the peace process, but are simply there to further their own agenda, but which are implemented in the name of peace. And again, I'm using this allegorically, so it may not be a single man as the false prophet and a single man as the Antichrist. It could very easily be an organization or two organizations. It could, again, even be a little bit of both, where there are organizations involved, but they send two representatives, the false prophet and the Antichrist, but who ultimately take their marching orders from others, or perhaps they start out that way and they gain power. But I can see a scenario where that sort of thing happens, where because the region is now so destabilized, and the world so divided over this issue, and because there's no clear resolution, they all attack Israel and fail, and now we have an even worse situation on our hands. We could be going into World War III. A charismatic leader is announced to the world, first by another charismatic man who gives prognostications but also a glimmer of hope, but says that he is not the one who will save us, and points to another who enters the room as a glorious champion of our freedoms and our rights, and who says he can fix everything, and who speaks with eloquence, and his golden tongue captures the world. And they sign a peace treaty, which according to dispensationalism is supposed to be for 7 years, but which fails halfway through at 3.5 years. Now, like I said, I'm using this allegorically. It could be a short-term peace treaty that's never intended to last that long, that is implemented on the basis that we need not just regional change, but world change. We need world government, but in order to facilitate that, we'll need time to work out how to do so and what exactly it would entail. So come join me at the table, friends. We can all talk about uniting the world in peace and restructuring the world governance so that these sorts of situations don't happen again. At which point, it wouldn't matter if it's a permanent peace treaty that's passed instead of a 7-year one, or one that is for 7 years, or one that's for 10 or 5 years, or something else. What's important is that there would be a peace treaty, but not necessarily an actual peace treaty. Rather, a call for a ceasefire under certain agreed terms that is necessary to work out the differences between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and that is necessary to work out the difference between that part of the world in general and the rest of the world, and that can ultimately bring about greater peace and cooperation through a restructuring of global relationships and the standards by which they are conducted. It may very well be that this sort of thing can be implemented without a formal treaty that's intended to last. It could be like I said, an agreement to a ceasefire and an agreement to a negotiation where people are told that during this time there shall be no more fighting. We will instead solve our problems like civilized, enlightened, rational adults. We will meet together and we will stop the warfare by coming to a proper agreement about the global situation. At which point, the wars are not truly over, but most people would think they are. Most people would be referring to this ceasefire as the end of a war. They would be referring to these accords as a treaty. But in reality, it may not actually be that. It may simply be a ceasefire and a call for global governance by people who are telling us that their only interest is in peace and that they are calling for this as a necessary step for it, but who are using this really to implement their own political agenda. Because let's face it, a worldwide crisis like this is a perfect opportunity to rewrite the global standards by which we live under. It happened before at the end of World War I, which was at the time called the Great War and the War to End All Wars. Naturally, that's not true because we call it World War I, and it was followed by its sequel, which was far larger and more deadly, World War II. After World War I, the world was restructured and worked differently than it had before. And after World War II, it was restructured again and worked differently than before, though less radically different than it did from before the First War. And there was even an attempt back then at a one-world government, or at least a governing system. Because during the Great War, Woodrow Wilson really pushed for the League of Nations, which was founded, but which the United States never joined, to the chagrin of Woodrow Wilson himself. But the League of Nations collapsed during World War II, and after World War II, the concept of it was revived, giving us the modern United Nations, giving us modern concepts of international law as well, and giving us modern ideas about boundaries and borders and international standards, including monetary standards where the United States would stay on the gold standard, but everyone else would go to a fiat currency tied to the United States dollar, which, of course, has been abandoned itself since the mid-1960s. Now the United States is also on a fiat currency. It could very easily be, though, that this sort of situation happens. So it is very eerily similar to the dispensational model. So perhaps the dispensationalists were right all along. Perhaps soon there will be a rapture of the church. Soon the Antichrist. Soon something will happen in Israel that will change the world and make ready the second coming. Or perhaps it is a coincidence. Or perhaps it's not a coincidence, but it is not completely correct, but it is based on the assumptions of human nature and a look at the situations that existed. But it doesn't really matter, because I still think it's a perfect way of understanding what will eventually happen. I actually do think that the world will move against Israel, be it actually militarily, or by a proxy, by supporting those that are fighting it, or simply by sanctions and freezing assets and other political means. I really do think that you will have a false prophet rise, be it an actual individual person, an organization, or an organization that's headed by an individual person, or perhaps that is choosing an individual person for a spokesman, who will then turn our attention to the Antichrist, who might work for the same organization, or who might be a different one that's related, or something like that. And I can see a ceasefire being called, and this crisis in Israel being used as proof that the modern world system is unstable, and we need a new system. We need a great restart. We need a new beginning to the world, man, a new age of global cooperation. And I can see the peace process being forecasted to take a long time. For our purposes, we'll say 7 years, but it need not be actually that. And I could actually see the peace process falling apart halfway through. And I can see the aftermath of that being bloody wars, vengeance, and tyranny. Of course, I've left out another part. The Antichrist will demand that he is worshipped as a god. He will rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, but he will go into it and declare, "I am God, worship me." This may not literally happen, but I can see what starts out as a global conference to bring about peace. At least ostentatiously, it's a global conference designed to bring about peace. Being co-opted and secretly implemented with the intent in mind of it being co-opted in this way, to actually be about pushing social reforms so a certain organized group or individual person who simply gained enough power to do this can reshape global politics to his will, and then setting up a list of principles, a philosophical model, a set of ideals to strive toward, that are then declared sacred, much like democracy and democratic principles in secular liberal democracy is considered sacred to us now. These things can be largely the same as the United Nations already has, but perhaps tweaked a bit here or there, and a few new things added, maybe a few things taken out. But once agreed upon, it may not be a man that's claiming, I am God, worship me. It may be, these are the ideals of humanity. These are the ideals we must live by and strive for. These we should hold as sacred, and perhaps even looking at some sort of organization, perhaps an actual world government, or at least a para-government organization that monitors countries, or perhaps just a political think tank like the World Economic Forum that gains tremendous influence, could then step in, tell us what we should implement, and be the keepers of the flame and the holders of the true interpretation of the ideology. I could actually see that happening. Whether or not a rapture of the Church for Christians happens is another matter, and I shan't even go into whether it will happen before the tribulation, during the tribulation, or after the tribulation. Because right now, whether this is an actual fulfillment of prophecy, or whether it is just a coincidence, or whether it is somewhere in between, being something that is perhaps contains prophetic elements misunderstood, or that contains understanding of how that part of the world works, overlaid with prophetic language, or that there was some glimmer of real prophecy, overlaid with assumptions. Who can say? But what I can say is, the dispensational model used within Christianity most definitely helps us understand the situation and its likely trajectory, because that does seem to be the direction it's going. And I honestly hope that at least part of this was wrong, the part where the peace process breaks down halfway through. Because if it doesn't break down halfway through, then while it would still be potent to use the imagery and language of dispensationalism to understand this situation, peace is always preferable. And I am not a dispensationalist. But at the same time, I don't think a peace process will endure. However, they could call for a peace talks, a ceasefire, and then actually implement a treaty people agree to when it breaks down just as saying. Still, what do you think of the situation? And I shall be revisiting this topic, but what do you think? I think that Norway, Spain, and Ireland, recognizing a Palestinian state, had rather bad timing. And I think it put us on a trajectory which not only isolates Israel, but which will force people like the United States of America to pick a side, and which will have dire consequences on the international order and international relations. Whether you think there should be a Palestinian state or not, the idea that during the middle of a war like this, the one being prosecuted by Hamas against Israel, the one Israel is engaged in, and declaring Palestine a nation, it just seems like you're adding fuel to a fire rather than help put it out. Even if you think that Palestine should have a recognized claim to a nation should have a nation, even if you think that. It simply isn't the time now. And it looks like we will need either divine intervention or devilish intervention to stop it. The situation, though, as I said, doesn't have me too worried. Precisely because I am a Christian, and I know that all is in the hands of God, and Christ Jesus will see us through. I don't want Palestinians to be killed by missiles. I don't want Palestinian children dying. But likewise, I don't want Israelis dying. And keep in mind, just as many Israeli children die as Palestinian ones. Just as many Israelis are being gunned down, just as many Israeli civilians are sometimes shot down. I wish Hamas had not fired its missiles. But it did. I do not think Palestinians are evil. I do not think that Israelis are evil. I do think that this conflict is evil. I do not think the conflict is primarily caused by this thing called religion, because there is no such thing as religion, not in the way people think. It's not some external force. Religion is nothing more than philosophy that we live by. And while it would definitely affect how one thinks about given situations, it isn't uniformly to blame, even when you talk about the specifics here, because most people don't realize that there's a lot more nuance to the situation in the Middle East than just one reads the Quran, the other reads the Bible, be it the Jewish Bible in this case, the 24 books of the Jewish Bible, which correspond to the 39 books of the Christian Bible, if you're asking. Some of the ones that are considered 2 books or more in the Christian Bible are considered 1 in the Jewish Bible. This war, to me, however, seems fruitless. To be honest, I wouldn't mind if Gaza and the West Bank became a separate nation, albeit discongruous because one's on one side of the country, the other's on the other. You would literally have to pass through Israel to get from one to the other. But, well, I guess you could go around like going through Syria and down, but I also wouldn't mind if they created a federal state where Gaza and the West Bank were integrated into Israel, but still had autonomy like states. I don't really have an easy solution for this problem myself. And I'm not afraid of saying that or ashamed, because this is a rather complex situation that I don't really think can have an easy solution, which is why leaders of the past had such a hard time with it. Modern leaders, of course, see it as an easy issue, but it's not. It's not simple, it's not straightforward, it is complex. And modern leaders are less competent, less rational, less intelligent than even those from 20 or 30 years ago. It's amazing how these simplistic narratives are running everything, and it causes errors because they don't recognize what's really going on. They just think in superficial slogans. I'm not saying the world was perfect 20 or 30 years ago. It by no means was, and plenty of ideological biases existed then too, but today's world seems rather single-minded and rather limited in intellect. And I'm afraid that our leaders, with their shortcomings and incompetences, I'm afraid they will not aid us. I'm afraid they can't come up with a better solution. In fact, while the people in the past admitted they couldn't come up with an easy solution, the modern ones are rushing ahead. And I'm afraid of the consequences that could happen if they do that. This could very easily escalate into a global war. I'm hoping it doesn't. I'm not saying it will. But honestly, it is a war with reasons most people in the West don't understand. But it is also a war, in my view, which could be ended if everyone could learn to love one another, respect one another. Indeed, what we call Israel or Palestine, or what you want to call it, the peoples living there could live in peace and harmony with each other in a single nation. But they don't. And I don't know the solution. But I know the solution that's being proposed now simply will not work and will play into the hands of powerful vested interests who, if they're smart, will manipulate the situation. Because if I were someone who is bent on imposing an ideology on the world, this is just the sort of situation that I would need to wait for to make that happen. And that is how I would act if I was the proverbial supervillain of the story. And one need not be a supervillain. One could just be ambitious. Still, I worry that will happen because it's happened before. Charismatic leaders promising peace, prosperity, and glory. And all you have to do is implement his ideology. All you have to do is listen to him. All you have to do is come under him. All you have to do is worship him, or at least his words, as a god. We saw it with Marx and Lenin and Mao. We saw it with a certain man whose name I can't mention, but who I shall refer to as Charlie Chaplin from the movie The Dictator. We saw it with Mussolini, with apologies for the mispronunciation. We saw it even after World War II, though not with an individual, mainly with three people, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, and out of those, mainly just Stalin and Roosevelt. We saw it with committees after that, organizations, not a single person who can be named. We saw it with the World Economic Forum and what it wants to do. Things like this happen. Things like this have happened historically, and things like this can and will happen again. And I'm afraid that this situation will mirror, if not fulfill, the prophecies that the dispensationalists tell us. Then again, it might fulfill the prophecies. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe dispensationalism is right. Maybe there will be a rapture of the church after all. But what I know is that I can confidently say, "Come soon, Lord Jesus," because we are very obviously not running the planet in a very wise way. Still, I'm not going to predict the end of the world. But I will say this. I've been thinking a lot of dispensational theology lately. And I have been thinking very, very long and very deep about its parallels to the real world situation. I shall take my leave of you now. Thank you. God bless, and goodbye.